4 years ago, I was manager at a staffing and recruiting firm in central Iowa. The job opened up my eyes to the realities of our workforce, but the most profound lessons I learned there were lessons about human nature, about our prejudices, and about our inability to escape our biases. In fact, those lessons were so profound, they would eventually alter the direction of my life. Now, our job was putting people to work. And one of the things I did not have was a whole lot of empathy for people who remained on the sidelines. In my view, individuals who were chronically unemployed were lazy and unmotivated. After all, there were plenty of jobs out there. They should go and work them. But slowly I began to meet individuals who would challenge those presuppositions. I met people who had barriers to employment. In some cases, they were individuals who had prior criminal convictions. Yet it was evident that they were trying to put their life on a new trajectory, trying to turn things around. In other cases, I met individuals who were dealing with disabilities, some physical, some mental. And yet it was evident that with a little bit of modest accommodation, these people could make a remarkable contribution in the workforce. But what I saw again and again was these job seekers were rejected by employers without consideration because they were simply assumed to be unsuitable candidates. And I guess the thing that troubled me most was the paradox that employers tended to complain about their inability to find motivated candidates, and yet by their very actions, by their very limited willingness to screen candidates, they were rejecting and exiling these highly motivated job seekers from the workforce. So it really troubled me, and I saw a lot of people like that who were cast aside. People like Rudy. Rudy stopped by our office one day. He was recently released from prison. And Rudy had a wonderful winning attitude and a cheerfulness about him. And yet he did have a sadness when it came to his past. You see, because of Rudy's background, he had really struggled finding work. And in fact, he'd been searching for weeks for employment. And yet, everywhere he turned, employers could see only his felony conviction. By the time he arrived in our office, I was sensing that his hope was beginning to fade. Now, I was really convinced of his sincerity, so it was important to me to try to help. I was eager to help Rudy find a new job and get on track with his life. So I jumped in, got on the phone, began calling a lot of clients and colleagues, but everywhere I turned, I hit the same wall. The felony conviction was disqualifying. When I had finally exhausted all my options, I sat down with Rudy and I gave him the bad news. And I'll never forget his response. He looked at me and he said, "It's okay. I know I've lost everything and I'll never get it back." I can still see Rudy walking out our door, carrying his past like a ball and chain. I began to get increasingly haunted by the individuals that we weren't able to help. You know, I didn't fault the employers for their caution because after all, as a hiring manager, my own life experience had taught me that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And yet the unwillingness of employers to have a look at these people on a case-by-case basis was not only robbing these individuals of an opportunity to rebuild their lives on the foundation of a good job. It was also robbing these employers of some great candidates that were getting away from them. So in my mind's eye, it seemed that the gap between this great untapped workforce and the employer community grew wider and wider, and I became fixated on the idea of bridging that gap. The challenge was, how do we persuade employers to reconsider their approach? Well, I knew from personal experience that statistics don't win hearts and minds, but personal stories have that power. So I began to wonder, what if I could capture the personal stories of people who had successfully overcome their employment barriers and found success in the workforce and share these stories with employers? Would those employers change their hearts in the same way they changed my heart? Would the stories speak to other struggling job seekers and give them hope and encouragement that perhaps there was a pathway out to success? I began moonlighting to develop a nonprofit called America's Job Honor Awards with the goal of celebrating individuals who overcome barriers to employment and the employers who hire them. And before long, what began as a moonlighting effort soon grew into the full-time personal passion of my life as the Job Honor Awards expanded into multiple states, and now we're working on expanding the nation. And the stories that we encounter are amazing. Henry Jordan is an individual who lives in inner city Chicago. And as he was growing up, he got involved in the law from an early age, like a lot of kids in his neighborhood. And in his teens, Henry joined a gang. And soon he found himself getting in increased trouble. He wound up doing half of his life in prison by the time he was 34 years old. Finally, on his last stint in prison, he was introduced to a job training program. And that job training program introduced him to jobs in, of all things, the conservation field. Well, Henry Jordan, who had never touched a chainsaw in his life, wound up planning and executing ecological restoration projects in the Chicagoland area. And now he's out of prison. He has a wonderful career, and he's a volunteer. He goes back and he mentors young kids in the same job training program that transformed his life. Nancy Rodriguez from Minneapolis ran away from home at age 11 to escape increasingly brutal abuse from her mother's boyfriend. She lived on the streets and sold drugs, and more often than not, she slept in a baseball field dugout across the street from the school that she should have been attending. Not surprisingly, she also ended up in prison. And while in prison, she was introduced by a job education program to the machining trade. She immediately fell in love with the trade, and now this young lady who never attended school past the 5th grade is an adjunct instructor at St. Paul College in machining. She's also an advocate for prison education that she credits with finally giving her a life worth living. Lee Toole was born with cerebral palsy. You know, Lee had a lot of struggles early in life. In fact, the doctors predicted that he would never attend school, let alone live independently. Nevertheless, Lee graduated from high school with honors, and he later pursued and received a degree in criminal justice. Yet he struggled for months to try to convince employers to hire him, but no employer could look past the walker and see the person. So he languished until he finally got in touch with a local disability employment agency, and that disability employment agency introduced him to a contact center where he was hired and immediately rewarded for his exemplary performance. You know, one of the things really striking about Lee is here's an individual who encountered more cruelty and more rejection in his life than most of us could ever imagine, and yet his coworkers consistently describe him as one of the most gracious and kind-hearted human beings they've ever met in their lives. Here's a picture of Lee and his dad at the awards ceremony. This was while Lee's honorary video was being played for the audience. We celebrate a new kind of hero. Our honorees are people of all races and ethnicities. They are veterans, they are immigrants and refugees, they're male and female, they're people from the cities, people from the country, people of all ages, yet they have something in common. They've overcome tremendous obstacles to find success in the workforce, and their stories are very moving and inspiring. But we recognize that employers exist to earn money. So in addition to making the moral arguments for hiring these individuals, it's very important that we also make a calculated business case. Well, the good news is we can make that case solidly. There are a number of different ways in which employers who embrace fair chance hiring benefit, and we'll just look at 3 reasons. First of all, they're able to tap into an abundant supply of candidates who are highly qualified. Now, that's especially meaningful when you consider that we live in an age of a diminishing workforce. Every day in the United States, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring. And because of our low birth rates and because of our restrictive immigration policies, a large number of these exiting baby boomers are not being replaced. As a result of that, companies across the nation are struggling to fill their open positions. Companies, however, that embrace this form of hiring, they tap into overlooked talent pools and they are rewarded with pipelines of highly motivated job seekers. Secondly, they are finding there some outstanding candidates. You know, one of the themes that tends to run through all of our honoree videos is this: overwhelming gratitude and not entitlement. People who have been through hell in their lives, they acutely recognize the value of a job in their lives. And in fact, we tend to interview the employers in all of our honoree videos. And one thing that we consistently hear from the employers is this. They say that people who overcome patterns of failure or challenges such as disability, they demonstrate remarkable work ethic and loyalty on the job, not despite their backgrounds, but rather because of them. Number 3, companies that go down this road wind up winning market share and attracting greater talent to their organization as their public image is enhanced. Increasingly, people want to do business with companies that demonstrate a good social conscience. They want to buy goods and services from those companies, and they want to work for them. Recently, Cone Communications performed a study of consumer behavior that revealed that 89% of Americans will guide their purchase decisions based upon whether or not a company supports initiatives that they consider to be important. And in fact, 78% of Americans will leave their current job to go and work for such a company. So clearly, there's much to be gained for those companies that wish to seize the high moral ground, especially in an era of commoditization, when it's increasingly difficult to separate yourself from the competition. These are some of the reasons. There are many more. There are tax advantages available to employers. Also, there are free supports available, especially for those companies that work with disability employment agencies. Often there are supports in the form of job coaches that will come in and work with their clients for a few days, a few weeks, whatever is required. And those services cost that employer not a nickel. Now, for those employers for whom all of these considerations are insufficient motivation to go down this road, please believe me, eventually mathematics will be sufficient motivation. Because in this country we have 70 million adult Americans who have histories of arrests or criminal convictions. 70 million. Our total population is about 238 million, I believe. So it's the same number of Americans as have 4-year college degrees. So obviously gone are the days when we can sentence these 70 million Americans with a lifetime of unemployment. We need their work. And similarly, we can no longer overlook the significant abilities of 54 million Americans with disabilities. The bottom line is this: in a diminishing workforce, we need all hands on deck. And the benefit to our society will be significant by having all hands on deck. First of all, we will have the advantage of the goods and services that those individuals create. We'll have the benefit of their purchasing power and tax dollars. More and more employers will have a committed and engaged workforce. And perhaps most importantly, more of our fellow Americans will be able to participate in the American dream and know the joy and the happiness that comes from that. I'm happy to report that this issue transcends politics. People on both sides of the aisle can get excited about the idea of more Americans participating in the American dream. In fact, I often speak in prisons, and there I meet hundreds of men and women who are trying to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives and form them into something beautiful, something meaningful. And when I stand on those stages and look out into the audience, I'm sometimes reminded of the words of President Garfield: "I would rather be with you and defeated than against you and victorious." Now, I hope that more and more of our policymakers embrace that attitude. Change is coming. There's no question about that. When you have companies as diverse as Coke Industries, Starbucks, Facebook, and Target, all of them seizing on fair chance hiring and doing wonderfully well with it, change is coming. You've got companies like Manpower Group rising up on the world stage to advocate for hiring that's inclusive. And they're basically vision casting for a world in which anybody who wants a job can have meaningful employment. Clearly, we have a lot of corporations stepping up. So change is happening, but unfortunately, much like with the civil rights movement, the change will occur too slowly for many people. There will be continually individuals with disabilities who will languish, cut off from the workforce. They'll never know the joy, the dignity, the social connections that come from a good job. Men and women will continue to be released from prison, filled with hope for a new life. And yet they will discover that they're roundly rejected by the workforce and essentially cast on the scrap heap of society. There's a lot to be said for hastening the process, because these aren't statistics, these are human beings. These are our brothers and sisters. And the thing is, a company can decide to be on the right side of history, and they can decide it tomorrow. And they probably will, if people like you and I apply the pressure of consumers and demand accountability from those companies. What's at stake here is absolutely enormous. Once upon a time, I honestly believed that every kid in America had an equal shot at economic success. The last 4 years changed my opinion. That was before I spent time in neighborhoods where 2 out of every 3 young boys will be either dead or in prison by age 18. It's before I stood on a street corner where a 14-year-old boy was gunned down, his dying words witnessed by his big sister, "Please don't shoot me no more, you already killed me." The fact is, pain and opportunity are not equally distributed in this country or anywhere else. But we as a society can reach out and we can help create opportunity for those who were dealt an atrocious hand. And at least when it's within our power to do so, we can welcome them into the workforce so they can build a stake, so they can improve their lives, transforming their lives for both themselves and their children. What's at stake in this initiative is far more than a more robust workforce. What's at stake is more than a pipeline of new and fresh candidates. What's at stake here is the soul of our nation. Thank you.